You've heard it your whole life. The United States government is founded on the principle of 3 co-equal branches of government. But what if that's not right? What if the Founding Fathers did not intend that? And what if believing it makes our politics worse? Who's got the power? The executive branch, Congress, or the courts? We've got the answers from UWO Now. So, Professor Siemers, thanks very much for being on the show with us today. Tell us about your book, or I should say this. You argue that the idea of 3 co-equal branches was never the founders' intent. Am I right? Is that correct? And what was their intent if that is the case?
Yeah, that's right, Wendell. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it. The book is titled The Myth of Co-Equal Branches, right? And I think you hear this in everyday conversation about politics quite a bit, that we have 3 co-equal branches of government, and people don't think a whole lot about it, and they just take that as a matter of course. And when I was a young professor, I did work on the American founding, and I read the Federalist Papers, this thing that was written by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison to argue for the Constitution when it was written, that it should be adopted. And I read some things in there that I thought indicated to me that wasn't their thinking at all. So I want to get this quote right, so I'm going to read off the page here. James Madison says in Federalist number 51, "In Republican government, that is popular government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates." The legislative authority necessarily predominates. For us, that's Congress, right? Or
right.
The state assembly and state senate.
Yeah. So we have 3 branches.
Yeah.
The executive, legislative, and judicial.
That's right.
And the legislative is called Congress at the federal level.
Right. And so here you have someone who's often called the father of the Constitution saying co-equal branches is not how it works in a popular government. The legislative branch necessarily predominates.
Now, did that stick out to you when you when did you a light bulb kind of go off for you?
Oh, well, I was in graduate school when reading through a lot of stuff on the Constitution. And I wrote my dissertation on that back at UW-Madison. And that was a long, long time ago. And so many people talk to me about politics. I'm a political science professor. That's inevitable, right? And people say, well, we have 3 co-equal branches. And they use that to explain a lot of different stuff. And it stuck in my craw a little bit as I heard it more and more and more. And I thought, that's just not how the Constitution is designed. Let me quote from Alexander Hamilton's Federalist number 78. He's talking about the judiciary there. And he's telling the opponents of the Constitution, hey, don't worry about the judiciary so much. You're writing a lot of newspaper editorials that say that the judiciary will be very dangerous at the federal level. But here's what he says in Federalist number 78. The judiciary is beyond compare the weakest of the 3 departments of power. So there was a clear hierarchy in the minds of the founders that the legislature, Congress, would be the most important institution that we have or branch that we have. They would be in the driver's seat. And this fits with a lot of kind of political theory that was being discussed at the time. John Locke. The term legislative supremacy is often bandied about at this time. They believed that the institution that would write the laws would be more representative. It would be representative of the people at large. And thus it would make better decisions because it would be deliberative. People would come to it with different ideas from different parts of the country, and you'd come up with some kind of approximation of a common good. And then they tell the president, what does the president have to do in Article 2? Faithfully execute the laws. So the presidency is not set up originally as being the primary leadership position in the government. The president is supposed to take advisement from Congress and faithfully execute what the Congress determines, right? So that's legislative supremacy. And as I delved into this deeper, I understand more and more. They gave Congress the power to set up the government. So every executive branch department, like the Department of State, the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, they're all set up by Congress. They're funded by Congress. Their mission is determined by Congress. Congress can change that mission through law. The person who is not really authorized to do that in a fundamental sense in terms of whether it exists or not, or whether it has the funding or not, is the president. The president is supposed to faithfully execute what the law says.
Okay, so jumped me a little bit, but I do want to get into that. So it is your contention that the founding fathers intentionally set out to have unequal branches of government. All of them have some powers, but not co-equal in power. And the most powerful of those branches is the legislative branch. Have I summed up what you said correctly?
Yeah, precisely. I sometimes tell my students, I don't call them the founding fathers because I'm a political scientist and I try to analyze things, so they're not my daddy. But I say the founders, right? And I understand that lots of people, this is our country, and we care about how it was set up, and we care about the Constitution. But if we're looking at this with kind of dispassionate eyes, that is, the eyes of an analyst, we can see that what they wanted to set up was the separation of functions of government. And that's kind of a different way of saying what you just said to me, right? They have different jobs. Congress legislates. The executive, the president, executes the law faithfully, we hope. And the judiciary determines what happens when there are disputes in the law, or when you don't know what the law actually means. Then the judiciary puts a gloss on it. And what this means is that we have a government where not every branch of government is working simultaneously on everything. It's not asked to. Congress legislates. That's the initial step, right? It works by deliberating and having the House and the Senate work through its processes.
Okay.
Once that works through to get a law passed, then the president is supposed to faithfully execute whatever that law is. And then if there happen to be controversies that arise as a part of that law or its execution, then someone can take suit in the federal courts, and that's the last step in the process. Now, the other branches can respond to what these other branches do, but we don't have a government where every branch is co-equally powerful on every subject. What that would create is what I call in the book a kind of Newtonian government, where any action can be stopped by any other action. And I think that's the implication of co-equal branches.
Well, okay, let's talk about co-equal, that phrase, co-equal, and the whole notion of having a co-equal government, of three co-equal branches of government. When did that notion begin to take form and shape and get running and be widely accepted by most?
That's a really interesting question, or the answer to it is really interesting to me, and that is a major part of the book. First of all, let me say that the branches are co-equal in a way, okay? Not in power, but in legitimacy.
Okay.
So Congress and the Supreme Court are equally legitimate institutions. They are empowered by the Constitution to do their job equally, right? But they have different jobs. So there are people in the course of American history who talked about the equality of the branches. What they meant early on is that they're equally legitimate. They're equally legitimate actors. They are empowered to do what the Constitution asks them to do. What they never meant until, I would say, that the 1950s was a bit of a watershed in this. My research shows that. There was a congressman, a senator actually, William Noland from California, who started using this phrase, co-equal branches, over and over again. And I wrote down some data here from a table in my book.
Okay.
There were 5 recorded instances in the 1930s of someone calling the branches co-equal. By the 1950s, when William Nolan was a senator, that's up to 77. By the 1970s, that's 380 instances in the congressional record of members of Congress calling the branches co-equal. And from there, it's picked up into by the media and by us in common parlance.
Could the use of this co-equal branches reveal some desire for there to be that? I mean, no one has really been arguing that fact that I know of, loudly at least, or not in great numbers. So is there inherently some desire for there to be co-equal branches of government?
Yeah, is there a motive?
Yeah.
Yeah, there is. And after this started being said in Congress, it's picked up and is part of our lexicon and what we hear and what we're okay with enough in 1973 and 1974 for Richard Nixon to use it as a defense in Watergate. So the Congress is investigating him, and he is potentially subject to even criminal proceedings in the courts. And he's pushing back on that very interestingly by saying, you can't do that because I'm a co-equal branch of government. The presidency is co-equal, and so you have to stay away. And he doesn't quite succeed at preventing people from kind of coming for his presidency. But what he did succeed at is reinforcing that idea that the branches are co-equal. And then Gerald Ford, in 1974, there is a landslide midterm election putting a massive number of Democrats into the House and the Senate. And essentially that party has veto-proof majorities. Mm-hmm. So none of the president's agenda can go forward. And in fact, they pass things like the War Powers Resolution and some various other things, the Budget Impoundment and Control Act, that presidents tried to veto, Nixon and Ford, and they were unsuccessful in doing that. What Jerry Ford did in 1974 on the stump in the midterm elections was say, I'm a co-equal branch of government, so don't vote for Democrats because we can't have them have a veto-proof majority. And it's really, to me, as an analyst of language and politics, a really stunning moment when the President of the United States is arguing against something that was very intentionally put into the Constitution, that if there are enough people who vote to override the president, that the president's veto will be overridden. So I think there has been in the modern presidency a wish to increase the power of the presidency. If you say that you're co-equal with Congress, you've suddenly leapt forward in power. And the judiciary has that same incentive. If you've been called by Alexander Hamilton, beyond compare the weakest of the 3 branches of government, you might want to, if you want to have influence, you might want to say that you're co-equal, and they do in their decisions.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm your host, Wendell Ray, and we're talking today with David J. Siemers, who is author of the book, The Myth of Co-Equal Branches, Restoring the Constitution's Separation of Functions. He is also a professor of political science at UWO. Why then, David, if it was obvious in the Constitution that there was no intention of there being co-equal branches, did no one say anything about this? Or were there people saying, no, that's not correct, during these times where others were saying there were co-equal branches?
Well, there are people who have pushed back against that, not for a long time, but I think back to the Jacksonian era, and this was the first time where a president really asserted independent power. And Jackson said something in one of his speeches that suggested that he thought of the presidency as a co-equal branch. I think on looking at that very carefully, he was suggesting that he had co-equal legitimacy, but the language is kind of unclear. And members of Congress really fought back against that hard. And in response to Jackson being the primary figure in American politics, the Whig Party was formed. And the Whigs' primary interest in politics was to have Congress lead rather than the president. And so they're pushing back hard on Andrew Jackson as someone who's kind of coming to the fore as the primary leader of American politics. And that's only one instance, right? But I think we've simply forgotten this part in a way, but also we have been maybe overly pragmatic in a way about our approach to politics. And it doesn't matter so much whether we follow the Constitution. People want results. And so they're willing to cut constitutional corners. In the long run, that's a real problem.
You write that the myth of co-equality allows each branch to justify overreach. Explain what you mean by that.
I think this is a very flexible concept. To say that you're co-equal and to know that people accept that as a truism about government means that you can use it in a lot of different situations. So the book came out in 2018, and I deal with presidents who are kind of like, well, let's take George W. Bush, right? And George W. Bush was often derided as someone who had an overly aggressive conception of presidential power. People in his administration put forward the Unitary executive theory, which essentially says that the president gets to say how the executive branch departments do their work, almost regardless of what the law says. Mm. He offers signing statements when bills are offered to him, saying that he will not administer or will ignore parts of bills. And this was never a part of the original constitutional design. In fact, you can't do that as president. You're asked to faithfully execute the law. Well, George W. Bush is no dummy, and he uses the term co-equal to suggest that he respects what Congress is doing, but that he can assert what he wants to do. So when he loses on an issue, he can say, I respect what the Supreme Court has done because they're a co-equal branch. When he engages in what a lot of people considered to be presidential overreach, and every president in the modern time has done things like that, he can say, I'm a co-equal branch of government, therefore I can do this. In other words, it doesn't really help us figure out what presidents can do and what presidents can't do. It's simply an assertion of power. And because he's equal, or the presidency is equal, anything can be done as long as he says that and tips the cap to a concept that we've already bought into.
Okay, presidential overreach, congressional abdication, and judicial activism. What is the connection between the separation of government departments and also this whole notion we're arguing today or talking about today, unequal powers, but equal legitimacy? How do we get to a point where we have overreach, abdication, and activism?
That's a long, long story. I'm afraid. There's scholars of political development who spend their whole careers on trying to figure that out, right? Let's deal with abdication. That's a great word, right? It means kind of like you have this power, but you don't want to use it, right? And you're using that to describe Congress. And already in the 1970s, there's a scholar named David Mayhew who writes a book called Congress, the Electoral Connection. And what he says is that Congress, the members of Congress are essentially single-minded seekers of re-election. That's what they care about. What that leads them to do is to shuffle off all the things that are controversial, right? So declaring war, that's something Congress doesn't do anymore. Let's give that to the president. Let's instead do things like talk about flag burning, right? Because, you ask people out in the, on the streets whether they think flag burning is a good thing or whether it should be illegal, and most of them will say it's illegal.
That's an easy one.
Should be illegal, right? So they're engaged in more position taking, like things that are simply positions that they don't mean to actually legislate on. Legislation is hard and it's controversial, and it creates winners and losers. And members of Congress don't especially want to do that. So they have given over a lot of that power to the presidency.
But how can they if that power does not reside with the president?
Well, there's a long history of delegation, right? And I don't think one can simply say that Congress can't delegate. It's the question of how much can Congress delegate. And if you're giving over, say, the ability to not only conclude trade agreements with other countries, but in fact, simply unilaterally decide what, say, tariffs should be, that's more congressional abdication that is very questionable when it comes to the constitutionality of it.
Okay, so have there, I guess, well, let's talk then about judicial activism and grabbing power maybe that they don't have. How did this arise? And are these things that could ever be taken back? Have we crossed lines that can never be, that you can go back to?
Right. I want to start answering you by saying that the purpose of me writing the book is to try to reconstitutionalize the United States if we can. And that is to get Congress to be a much more active legislative body that actually makes policies that address our problems. And we've had trouble doing that for at least the last 20, 30 years. There are a variety of reasons for that, but abdication is one of them, right? So, I do believe that the people can elect individuals who are ready to do that, and that through greater publicity, we can understand that the president should be a more faithful executor of the law. The judiciary is maybe a harder nut to crack. You ask, how did that get to be in the judiciary? And I think that's a long story as well. But maybe a short version of it is this. In the 1950s and 1960s, the court saw itself as the primary protector of human rights. And there was good reason to do that in the civil rights era. And a kind of backlash developed that, maybe the judiciary should be used for other purposes besides that. And it has come to protect presidential power, and I think to a large extent corporate power. And so there are very vested interests on the side of having the judiciary be powerful. If Congress creates a law and the president is commanded to faithfully execute that law, and the judiciary is a weak branch, relatively speaking, then it's Congress that really speaks with definition to define what our country is like. And there are many people who don't want our government to have an approach that can actually work. The status quo works for them. So, one of the things that makes co-equality so powerful is that it can be taught in a 6th grade class or something like that. And I think there's another phrase, checks and balances,
yes,
that is really central to most Americans thinking about politics. So much so that we almost worship checks and balances. We look back at the founding era and we say they wanted many checks to be built into the government. In fact, there are people who claim that the American government was made not to work very well. And I again reference my research in the founding era, and I'm befuddled because they actually wanted to create a government that worked much better than the government that they had. And they thought they might have gotten one. And in fact, we've loaded up for instance, the legislative process with additional checks that were never intended, like the filibuster. And I would say that frequent judicial review on every single major piece of legislation is another check that was not intended by the founding generation. And I want to say here that I'm not referring to the founding generation because I want to go back and think that they had all the answers. No one has all the answers, but they wrote they wrote the Constitution with intent, and we've lost the intent. And if we favor checks and balances over effectiveness, there is a huge long-term price to be paid in that we don't have a very effective government.
I was going to ask, as we wrap things up, what, as someone who studies and has studied and has put a considerable amount of time into this subject of the departments, as they're called by the founders, and checks and balances, and whether there are co-equal, which you believe there are not co-equal, co-legitimate, but not certainly equal in their power. What concerns you, or does there anything concern you more than it used to? And I'm talking about our government.
I think, like a lot of people, I'm hugely concerned about things these days. And it's 7 years since I wrote this book, and I think we've had significant movement. So I think people are saying less that we have 3 co-equal branches of government. I don't hear the president saying that. I don't think he wants to claim that. In fact, he wants to claim that he is the lead figure in our government. And there's a phrase that some people use, party over country or something like that. It seems like the two parties are very much in lockstep internally. And the presumption was that the people going to Congress would have sufficient independence of mind and an interest in what that institution does to make it work successfully, simply by applying their own ambition. Like their ambition was attached, James Madison essentially says in Federalist number 51, to the institution. But I don't think anyone can say that the members of Congress currently in office are especially yoking their ambition to their own institution. Instead, they're yoking their ambition to a party leader.
You mentioned Federalist Paper number 51, written by Madison, I believe, correct? Madison, yeah. If someone out there listening wanted to kind of find out what you're talking about, go to the grasp, to the nub of it, where would you suggest they start to look to find out what maybe the intent of those framers of the Constitution meant when they started putting these departments together? Where did you start, and where would you suggest someone else might want to start reading about this subject?
Yeah, I don't think the Federalist Papers are a bad place to start, but I'm going to say first and foremost the Constitution itself. Look at the structure of the Constitution. Look at Article 1. It is almost 10 times the size of Article 3, which sets up the judiciary, right? So Article 1 is about Congress, and it goes through step by step how to create a Congress, what it looks like, what are some rules, who are the leadership, and Article 1, Section 8 talks about the powers of Congress. Why was it so important for the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 to spell out the powers of Congress such that you have, 17 different articles or whatever it is? Because they were afraid in popular government, as Madison says, that the legislature would dominate. I think they're mistaken about that. At least in the last 100 years, executives have come to dominate democratic politics in ways that they didn't understand. And that's okay that they didn't understand it because they had very little experience with popular governments. Only, 12 years between 1776 and 1787. So they were, I think, mistaken about that. So they listed all these powers so that Congress wouldn't go beyond that. And then they were more vague about the presidency, right? They felt that they didn't have to spell that out as much because the president didn't need to be contained as much. And people have driven a Mack truck through that hole of vagueness, right? But I go back to the faithful execution clause, right? The president has to faithfully execute the law, and that shows what the job primarily is. I mean, there are other powers there, commander-in-chief power, pardon power, etc., right? But fundamentally, in executing the law, the president is supposed to be a follower, essentially. And then Article 3 is tiny. It only talks about what the jurisdiction of the federal judiciary is, and it creates one court, the Supreme Court of the United States. And it says to Congress, you create the federal judiciary how you see fit. Now, you can't have co-equal branches if you have one branch empowered to create the whole other branch, essentially, right? But that's the way it is with the presidency and the executive establishment, too. Everything that the president has, all the executive departments, all the personnel, all the funding come from laws. And that's Congress. So this is a system that was supposed to have legislative supremacy. I realize here we are nearly 250 years down the road. We've made a lot of compromises, but at some point we have to decide that our constitutional system is worth saving by reinvigorating Congress instead of having one person or one institution control things.
Okay. Thanks very much, David Siemers, for coming by and talking to us today on UWO Now. It's been an interesting conversation.
My pleasure, Wendell. Thanks for having me.
That's all the time we got today for UWO Now. Remember, you can watch each episode of UWO Now on our YouTube page. I'm Wendell Ray. Thanks so much for joining us.